Do you remember them all? Do you remember them all? Those that told you that Jeremy Corbyn was going to reduce the number of Labour MPs to the lowest level since 1931? Do you remember those that said Labour might not survive as a party after last year's general election exactly 365 days ago? Do you remember those who said that Corbyn was a disaster waiting to happen? Do you remember Dan Hodges? Do you remember Gabby Hinsliff? I could go on, but I'll spare their blushes. Do you remember those Labour MPs that were captured on camera in their crushing disappointment that all their predictions for which they had toiled so hard came to naught, as Corbyn scored the biggest increase in the Labour vote since Clement Attlee in 1945, as Theresa May lost her parliamentary majority, as Corbyn captured seats that had never been Labour before, and all on the basis of a real Labour manifesto promising a real Labour government for the first time since the 1970s. Do you remember? Me, I'll never forget. Stephen Kinnock, I will never forget your face. All the others whose names are not even worth remembering, that were captured on videotape, crushed, bereft, tears, metaphorically speaking, rolling down their cheeks as their own party defiantly refused to go quietly into the good night of the crushing defeat that they, Labour MPs, had worked so hard to bring about. I could list them all, but most of them are not worth listing. But just never forget this. If it had not been for the fifth column inside the Labour Party that had tried every waking hour and dreamt of it in their sleep to undermine their own leader and their own party, if it had not been for them, Jeremy Corbyn would be on his way to Canada for the G7 summit as the Prime Minister of Britain. It would be the Corbyns that were living at 10 Downing Street. The Brexit omni-shambles would not be taking place. A new foreign policy for Britain would already be in place. Don't blame the Conservatives. Don't blame the right-wing media. Blame the traitors in Labour's own ranks who played accomplice, collaborator to the enemy, and thus deprived Britain of a decent government and landed us with this. And what is this? Has there ever been a more shameful shambles than this? Has there ever been a government whose day comes to an end without knowing if it will fall in the morning? Has there ever been a government where cabinet ministers can openly rubbish their prime minister, but she's too weak to sack them? Has there been a day ever where a British prime minister would be ranting at the US president as to why Russia should not be at the G8 and it be returned to the G8 that it was before? Has there ever been a British government presiding over a slide into absolute chaos? You heard on the news about the 100-year-old woman who was murdered. If you're in London, you've seen the news of the 90-year-old woman who lies in a hospital bed clinging to life after somebody broke into her house and mercilessly beat her. Has there ever been a government that presided over, as we begin this long, hot summer, a lawlessness, a descent into criminal chaos like Britain currently is experiencing? In Cheshire, where a family had to deal with armed intruders who told them, either hand over everything you have or we'll go upstairs and murder your children. Where people are climbing onto people's cars on the North Circular Road in London, climbing into their sunroofs with large zombie knives and threatening to cut their throats if they don't hand over their watches. Where people are being machine-gunned. Yes, machine-gunned in the London borough of Brent, just a few streets away from where my children play. Has there ever been a government that has presided over such a catastrophic crime situation as we face today, and yet not only not stepped up to the plate, but have left the catastrophic cuts in police numbers for which the Conservatives are responsible? If that long hot summer goes up literally in flames, we'll be fighting the flames with fewer firefighters, fewer appliances, operating out of far fewer fire stations, thanks to our government and our Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, and the wastrels trail that he left behind him as Mayor of London. Has there ever been a Mayor of London so small as to be utterly invisible in the face of all this carnage and chaos, from Croydon to Brent, to Kensington and Chelsea, across the city? No one is safe. And where's the mayor? He's standing in Oxford Street, bemoaning the fact that it has not yet been pedestrianised, and thus the toxic air of Oxford Street is a bigger danger to Londoners than guns and knives and far, far too few police officers. He's more concerned about the colour of the faces of London's cyclists, their sexual orientation, their class position, than he is about the fact that thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Londoners are going around with swords down their trousers, ready to plunge them into other people. That people are carrying automatic weapons when they go about their criminal business in the streets of our capital. If I were the Mayor of London, I promise you, I'd be chained to the railings at Westminster until and unless Theresa May and the Home Secretary, whoever that is today, reinstated the police cuts for which they are responsible. And I'd be coming up with some idea that would at least give confidence to the people living in London that they're not going to be murdered in their beds, or their 90-year-old grandmother won't be brutally assaulted and left fighting for their life for their handbag. It is a sorry tale, just not quite as sorry as that taking shape again this evening, Friday, Death Day, Killing Day, on the border fence between Gaza and Israel proper, as the world describes it. And I want to take my metaphorical hat off tonight to a man I never thought I'd ever praise. The Right Honourable Michael Howard, now Lord Howard, former leader of the Conservative Party, a Jewish man of some distinction, who confronted Benjamin Netanyahu in Parliament in London yesterday, and who asked him, if you'll forgive the phrase, the killer question: why, Prime Minister, do you have to kill them? People 100 meters from a fence which they cannot scale. Why do you have to kill them? Well, Netanyahu was embarrassed by Lord Howard's question, coming as it did from who it did, but it hasn't stopped the killing. At this moment, many are dead again at the Gaza fence, and hundreds have been shot. 13,800 people have been wounded in the last 6 weeks. 116 and climbing have been shot dead, many of them children, many of them women, including those killed and wounded today. A 14-year-old boy is already one of the dead. Just get your head round that. 13,800 unarmed protesters have been wounded, most of them by live gunfire, in 6 weeks in the open-air prison, as David Cameron called it, called the Gaza Strip. Is anyone paying attention? Well, I don't know. But when an Israeli sniper fixed in their sights the white medical coat of Razan Najjar last Friday and put a bullet through her heart from behind, soaking her white medical coat in blood, which ran out in the sand as her life ebbed away, I like to think that somewhere, that the real soak was the soak of shame. The cloak of murder was torn away that day, and I like to think that maybe a watershed amongst the bloodshed had occurred. All of that and much, much more coming up tonight on the mother of all talk shows. It's the boss's anniversary today. This is Radio Nowhere in the sense that people are listening to it everywhere. Everywhere in the world, people are tuning in. Certainly to this show, as I know from my social media. I know from TalkSport's social media also that 4 of the top 5 videos on the station's Facebook page are my videos. I know from the numbers, the fantastic increase in our audience. I know from the swell of social media coming into the show, some of which I'll be able to get to tonight, that people are switching on the radio for the mother of all talk shows. Now, exactly a year ago, as I said in the beginning, every know-all, every smartass, every sage, every pundit, every seer had egg dripping from their face. They had predicted a massacre, a wipe out, a 3-figure Conservative majority, as did many of the opinion polls. But it didn't work out that way. Now, Mike Indian, whom I've had on the show before and was mightily impressed, is a political blogger and a commentator for the Groucho Tendency. It's a tendency I lean to myself. Groucho Marx, that is. And he joins me now again. Mike Indian, welcome.
Hello, George.
Now, you've got a memory worth hearing. Let's go back 12 months to the day when everyone was waiting for the exit poll, which they all predicted would be a sweeping, perhaps annihilating Conservative victory. Didn't work out that way, did it?
Quite so, George, and you could hear the collective thud of jaws hitting the floor in Westminster as David Dimbleby intoned there would be a hung Parliament at 10 p.m. on the 7th of June 2017. You only had to think just how far the Conservatives' fortunes in that campaign had fallen from a 20-point opinion lead to Labour gaining 30 seats and increasing the share of the vote to one of the largest it had gained in recent memory. Truly a remarkable achievement and not the campaign that anyone really predicted.
How did they get it all so wrong, Mike? Is it just that they live in a bubble and the wish was the parent of the prediction?
I think that, George, this is an election unlike any that we've seen before and probably ever will see again in this country, called by a Prime Minister who wanted to obtain almost presidential mandate for implementing a policy that was controversial, to say the least, in the form of Brexit, a Labour leader who has never really before been tested in frontline politics in the form of Jeremy Corbyn, and, of course, a campaign which really, I think, failed to deliver the answer that people wanted to hear about the country's exit from the European Union, and, of course, in Jeremy Corbyn's case, a set of policies actually that many people found in certainly unpredictable sections of the country largely persuasive.
It was a very personal election in the sense that she had no need to call it, so it was Theresa May's election. She knocked the word Conservative off the podium at such events as she did do, and I'll come to that again in a minute. And it was Theresa May, it was the Prime Minister, it was a vote of confidence or otherwise in her. And therein lies the fundamental reason why her government, having lost its majority in those circumstances, is now in a state of, well, paralysis would be to put it mildly. It's in a state of chaos, isn't it?
It certainly doesn't seem to be any more in control, George. But the Prime Minister is still in office after a year. Don't forget that for sort of 72 hours after that election, we were still predicting that she wouldn't be able to cobble together a deal with the DUP. Now, a year on, the government's running the gauntlet, as it were, not only with dealing with thorny questions like the question of abortion in Northern Ireland, but they're facing on Monday and Tuesday next week the Brexit bill comes back to the House of Commons, Tuesday and Wednesday, I should say, back in the House of Commons, and they are having to deal with House of Lords amendments on a whole variety of issues. I think Theresa May is stable but weak, we might say.
Certainly not strong and stable. You say weak and stable. I say weak and utterly unstable, fatally unstable. I'm not sure that she'll still be there next Friday, but we'll see how that works out. But look at the price that she's paid, Mike, for the DUP deal. First of all, she's clinging to power on the tassels of an orange sash. Secondly, she's forced, as a self-proclaimed feminist, to preside over a completely different abortion law in 6 counties of the realm, and indeed a completely different abortion law to that which will obtain in the 26 counties south of the border. But perhaps most significantly, she's paralysed on Brexit because she cannot do the utterly logical thing and draw the boundary between Britain and the EU in the middle of the Irish Sea.
It's one of these things, George. You just have to look at the customs backstop paper published yesterday to see how the government is twisting itself in knots, trying to make an unworkable solution work. We're going to need some form of customs arrangement in order to keep the Northern Ireland situation working, but that does mean differential treatment, as you say, for the rest of the UK, logically, if she wants to take us out of the single market and the customs union. Now,
of course, the plotting is heavily underway. The maybe released by himself, tape recording of Boris Johnson's speech the other day. It was as brazen political defiance by a senior cabinet minister of their prime minister that I have ever seen. I mean, Harold Wilson had a lot of trouble in the 60s staying on top of a cabinet of real heavyweights, most of whom wanted to be the prime minister themselves. But since then, we've had prime ministerial government in this country. Now we've got Hammond pursuing one policy, Boris Johnson pursuing another, David Davis yet another, Liam Fox yet another, and that's before these crunch votes next week.
Exactly, George. And I think the real issue is here that you just have to look at the mirth that was widely reported to be given when Number 10 spokesperson was questioned by the lobby today about how she would deal with Boris Johnson. Number 10, they have an uneasy choice. And even yesterday's rumours of David Davis resigning from the cabinet.
Yeah, these things are happening every day. I'd forgotten even to ask you about that.
It just shows you how difficult it is. The Prime Minister is coming before the Conservative Parliamentary Party on Monday night about 6 o'clock inside Parliament to talk to them. God knows what she'll be saying to them. It'll probably be a Brexit update as well. But she's facing a difficult, challenging week, as she has almost every week since the election.
Yeah, I mean, there must come a point at which she thinks it's not worth the candle carrying on, don't you think?
I think if you just have to read Tim Shipman's excellent book, Fallout, you really get a sense of how fractious the atmosphere in Number 10 was. But there have been strong efforts to try and stabilise things as far as they can. It's a listing leaky ship in the form of the government at the moment. But the Prime Minister has stayed in office because she has rallied round. Sacrificial lambs like Amber Rudd have helped her do that, but she's lost a lot of close aides to her. And also, I think, George, we have to really look at the fact that Labour have made some quite shrewd moves on Brexit policy as well, but we still haven't heard, I think, from Jeremy Corbyn's camp, a really coherent argument of what they would do if they were inside Number 10 on Brexit.
Well, they don't have to, of course. It's not the job of the opposition to negotiate Brexit. And as Corbyn, I thought, brilliantly pointed out on Wednesday, the opposition are not negotiating Brexit, but then neither is the government. It's the job of the opposition to oppose the government. But you're right. This masks, in many ways, an even more dangerous division inside the Labour Party. Because the truth is, the backstabbers that spent the whole of Corbyn's leadership prior to the general election a year ago, undermining him, trying to destroy his leadership and have him overthrown and replaced, they haven't gone away. They're still there. They're nursing their wrath to keep it warm. They're waiting for the opportunity to wound him further, aren't they?
I think, George, what's obvious is that there is going to be a substantial movement on the Labour backbenches from people like Chuck Miller, who I assume you're referring to there, who do favour membership of the single market. This is very much an issues-based thing, I think, because don't forget, despite the fact that we had this interesting change in language from the Corbyn leadership this week about amendments on the internal market. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean single market. That, to me, however, means trying to pressure the government for greater customs alignment too. But there are going to be large numbers of Labour briefs and those 15 Tory rebels who will be looking to try and defeat the government on some form of closer regulatory alignment with the European Union. That's what the Labour leadership is going to be under pressure for, I think.
Do you think the 15 Tory rebels will hold firm? Are their knuckles being crunched? Are they being offered all kinds of exotic flights on fact-finding missions to the South Seas? Is there anything being done that can stop these rebels voting against the government?
I think it really depends on the personalities of the individual MPs. MPs like Anna Soubry, Ken Clarke are very vocal opponents of the government's Brexit strategy here, but the softer ones, some of the Scottish Tories like Andrew Bowie, for example, could be more easily persuaded. Sarah Wollaston might be counted upon to vote with them, but at the end of the day, I don't think there's much more effective leverage that can be brought by the Chief Whip than simply mentioning, if you vote with us on this, we stand a chance of staying in power. If you vote against, you're letting in a Corbyn Labour government. And for many Tories, that ideological split, the idea of letting in a government which, in their ideas, would create a socialist nightmare, their view, not mine, I should say, would perhaps keep them going to the lobbies out of a question of loyalty over policy.
Finally, and I'm grateful for your time, extraordinarily, I just saw Andrew Neil's tweet of the latest breaking YouGov poll, which puts, amongst all this chaos, the Tories 7 points ahead of Labour. That seems to me to be a potential starting gun for yet another British general election.
I think, George, the last thing the Tories are going to want is another election at the moment. I think, don't forget, we have to remember, with the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, that if the Prime Minister is forced out because of any motion of no confidence, which I still think is the most likely mechanism for bringing her down, it then falls to Labour to try and form a government as well, and then an election is called. We're still quite a way off that yet, but we've got to acknowledge that since the election last year, both parties have maintained fair shares of their vote, around sort of 40-45%, but the Labour share has been eroded. So I think in Jeremy Corbyn's case, he has made his mark there, but he really has to look to a firmer Brexit policy in order to win voters back over to him if the country goes back to the polls sooner than 2022.
Mike Indian, political blogger, commentator for the Groucho Tendency. As Groucho Marx famously said, any club that would have me as a member, I wouldn't want to join. Now let me turn to the ocean, actually, of written material that's coming in. Jimmy says, got Mr. George Galloway Moats on talkRADIO, watching the Speedway World Pairs Final on TV on mute with my two daughters, Sarah Jane and Leanne. Say hello, George. Hi there, girls. What a Friday night. Marie, my old friend, says, all showered and ready for Moats after watching lies told at the SNP 18. That's hashtag SNP18. No lies or Tory pandering on this show. Thank you, Marie. And Vlog368 says, Isle of Man, or is that too much of a tax haven and a simple no-no for politicians? I don't know what that relates to, but I did give a speech in the Isle of Man just a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago maybe, and had a full house, I think. So, yes, I'll be taking my George Galloway and Friends tour to the Isle of Man if public demand is there. The first one's in Liverpool, by the way, at the beginning of September, calling it The Outsiders, and it's me and Red Ken Livingstone. And it'll probably be at the Everyman Theatre, though that's not yet finally confirmed. Mike Evans says, when I was young and ignorant, then I would disagree with this. After growing up and realising the crimes of the British Empire, in particular with Ireland, then I absolutely agree with you, George. And that's Bob Justice. I always look forward to the Moats. It seems like an age since it's been on talkRADIO. The change of schedule last week was a good opportunity to catch more real radio, but the morning slot is not the best time to unleash the beast. Come, let's have this show on every night. Well, you're right. I'm better in the evenings. Gary Denhill says, George, I'm in a good mood and feel a poem coming on. Friday night with Mr. G is like having cake and tea, discussing the crucial topics of the day, no holes barred when George has his say. So make sure you tune in on Fridays 7 to 10. talkRADIO's the place, you can. Thank you, Gary, very nice. And Chris says, I 100% agree with Trump on Russian reinstatement to the G7. It's always better to keep talking. Excuse me, we do not have moral authority to dictate to anyone. This is a reference to the President of the United States demanding that Russia be reinstated to the G7, making it again as it was the G8, and the British Prime Minister, bereft of even a parliamentary majority, denouncing the idea. Matt says, I'd be lying if I said I haven't been waiting for Galloway all week. And 2 minutes in, and it's already worth the wait. Go get them, Galloway. You're a rare gem. Thank you, Matt. Very lovely. And Tony D. Malley from Stirling says, last night I watched John Oliver's hatchet job on Venezuela, which had been posted on your Twitter account. It was redolent of the punching down type smears deployed against Corbyn. Has satire always been this poor, George? It hasn't, Tony. I mean, I worked at Private High for many, many years. And by and large, the point of Private Eye then was to punch upwards at power, those in power, with wealth, with office. Now, Private Eye, Have I Got News for You, Frankie Boyle, David Baddiel, the whole raft of what passes for comedy and satire today actually tries to hold the opposition to account far more rigorously than it does the government. And here's a text. Despite the lies and smears of the Murdoch Empire, which you now work for, and the useless May running an appalling campaign, Corbyn managed to finish second. That's from a gutless coward not even prepared to put their name on their text, let alone call 0344 499 1000. How about it, gutless coward? Let me tell you again, 0344 499 1000. Come on, coward. Come and have a go. Or aren't you hard enough? And Madge says, GG, why has our PM taken her hubby to the G7? He stood with her and the Canadian PM for pics. Trump is alone. Where's Melania? Says Madge. Well, therein lies a tale, I think. Perhaps gone the same way as Posh Spice. And Redbeard Rum says Northern Ireland's never made sense, but this is a frying pan to fire idea that won't work. The Northern Irish ought to control Northern Ireland instead of plucking at the coattails of higher state authority. Yeah, right. Now, one more before the break. Cam A says debating rights or wrongs of today's action is useless without adding previous. The list is endless, from the King David Hotel bombing, the USS Liberty, it's the anniversary of that, by the way, this week, 50th anniversary of that. The USS Liberty bombing and sinking, massacres from Shatila, Sabra and Jenin, the Mossad using people's passports to murder in Dubai, the whole siege of Gaza. Let me take a break for some capitalist messages. Not aimed at anyone in particular, that song, but it is called Poison by Alice Cooper. Now, I wanted to talk to Annie Machon, former MI5 Intelligence Officer, not just because she's a wonderful talker and I always enjoy speaking with her, but because of really some significant news that came from inside the German Chancellery this week, which said, and I think it can be inferred that this was the case for all European countries, because if it were not so, it would be inexplicable that Germany had been excluded. But sources close to the German Chancellor said that Britain has still not provided any evidence that Russia was responsible for the Skripal Salisbury poison attack. And the unspoken point being made by the German source was that European countries took Britain and Theresa May in particular on trust when she told them that she had the goods, she had the receipts, that definitively, and within 72 hours or so, perhaps less, of the attack itself, that the Russian state was responsible for it. And the inference of the statement coming from Berlin was a sense of disappointment that though Britain's European allies, for now, had taken action, sanctions, expulsions, as a result of Theresa May's request, they were a trifle disappointed that they still have seen no evidence. Perhaps that's because no such evidence exists. Let's hear what Annie Machon has to say. Annie, welcome back.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me, George.
It's a pleasure always. It is the case, isn't it, that not only have the Germans not seen any evidence of Russian involvements, neither have we in Britain.
Indeed, yes. In fact, if we go right back to the start of this whole case, we had a situation where the UK Scientific Weapons Institute, the Porton Down, was apparently, according to UK former Ambassador Craig Murray, who has lots of contacts in that field, was actually involved in a fight with the UK government because the UK government wanted Porton Down to say definitively that this must be a Russian nerve agent. And Porton Down said, no, it might be something that might be of a family of nerve agents, the Novichoks, that was developed by the Russians back in the 1970s and 80s. And they refused to be moved from that position. And then, of course, Theresa May, in her statement to Parliament, used the same language. It was highly likely of a family that might have been developed by the Soviets. And that was the language she used when she tried to get all her Anglophone and NATO allies to expel diplomats Russian diplomats, and they use the same language there. So there has been no proof whatsoever all the way through this about exactly what this agent was. I mean, there's been speculation. It might have been a Novichok A234. There's been no proof, clear proof about precisely how it's been administered. There's been speculation it was put on the door handle of the house, but there's been no evidence. And the police said right at the start of the investigation, this investigation will take months, probably.
And
so
that there are many lines open. The police said this week there are many lines of investigation open.
Well, of course there are. I mean, for Theresa May within the first few days to say unequivocally it must be a Russian state attack was bizarre, because it was some sort of agent that might have been theoretically developed in the 70s or 80s in the Soviet Union. And therefore it must only be Russia who applied it today. And yet it turns out, subsequently, over the last few weeks, it turns out that the Organization for Prevention of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, with working with the Iranians, actually developed Novichoks for the first time, they thought, in 2016. It was all done legally to try and work out ways of combating these things. And then there have been reports in things like the very esteemed New Scientist magazine in the UK saying that many, many countries would have had access to the formulae around Novichoks. And in fact, there was a Russian defector who fled the USSR as it was falling apart. He went to America. He was apparently one of the developers of the Novichok agents, and he then published a book with all the formulae in 2008, which was when the case broke in Britain 3 months ago. That book was still openly available on Amazon.
Yes.
So anyone, anywhere with a laboratory could have tried to create these sort of nerve agents. So for Theresa May, within 3 days, to have said it must be the Russian state that did it, it's just unfeasible. And it's embarrassing for Britain that she got a lot of her allies to expel Russian diplomats. It's embarrassing for Britain, particularly in terms of the Brexit era, that she's going to alienate a lot of natural allies by doing so.
Now, President Putin spoke about it this week in his annual 4.5-hour grilling on any subject by anyone who rings up. No Western politician would ever put themselves in that position live on television. He said this week, and in a way it's sort of axiomatic, if it had been a military-grade nerve agent, the targets would have been dead in seconds or at most a few minutes. But that's not what happened. If, as we were told more or less definitively, certainly by every media outlet who had been briefed accordingly, that the administering was done on the door handle of the family home, which they left 3.5 hours before they collapsed.
Indeed, yes. I mean, there was so much speculation at the time about how the nerve agent could have been administered. I mean, first of all, it was going to be door handle or car vents or cereal brought from Russia or whatever. But yes, if it's military-grade nerve agent, which is supposed to be more toxic, massively more toxic than VX nerve agent, which was used to kill Kim Jong-un's half-brother in Malaysia last year, then yes, it would have killed within minutes.
That was of a type developed by us, by the way. VX,
yes,
which is 8.5 times less powerful than Novichok, it was of a type developed by Britain.
Absolutely. It was developed in Portendown in the 1950s. So to say that something developed in the 1970s under the Soviet Union means that Russia did it, means that if someone else uses VX developed in Portendown in the UK in the 1950s, Britain must have carried out that attack, right? I mean, it's the same logic. It's crazy.
It is insane. Now, we're the only people talking about this because nobody handed me a D notice, presumably because they knew I'd take it to Trafalgar Square and proclaim it from the plinth. But everyone else has stopped talking about a story that everyone was speaking about, speaking of little else, 3 months ago. You know about D notices and the like. What's your take on that?
I've heard rumours that there have been D notices slapped on the UK media in the immediate aftermath and then a week later as well. And those D notices potentially might have been put in place. And I'm only saying what I've heard reported. potentially put in place to stop speculation about what Skripal was involved in the 8 years since he received political asylum, effectively, in the UK. So this was a man who betrayed his country, was caught, was imprisoned, and was released under the spy swap in 2010. He then had 8 years living openly in the UK, pensioned off by MI6, who were his employers, because he was a traitor to Russia. So that my question right from the start of this case has always been, what was he doing in those 8 years? And it appears that he might have been in contact with the person who originally recruited him, a man called Pablo Miller. And he was someone who recruited him to work for MI6. Now, it turns out that Pablo Miller and Skripal stayed in quite close contact. They both lived in
Salisbury, yes.
Yeah. And Miller allegedly was also working for the company that was run by Christopher Steele, the man who created the dirty dossier, allegedly, on Donald Trump. He was paid to do that by Donald Trump's Republican rivals initially, and then that was taken over and paid for by the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton's party, in the run-up to the election in America. So that is a very interesting question. What precisely was Skripal working on in those 8 years when he was in the UK? And I think that is where the motive for any sort of attempted hit would come from. It might well be someone from Russia. It might be someone he'd crossed, he'd betrayed in Russia. It might be organised crime. Or it might be something else from other intelligence agencies for other reasons.
Well, one of these could be the Ukraine, which just last week pretended that Russia had murdered a man who hadn't been murdered and it had all been staged.
Indeed, yes. I mean, that was an absolute gift to Russia, because it doesn't matter what else happens now in the future. Every time anyone says, oh, Russia's tried to carry out a hit on one of their dissidents or one of their traitors or whatever, they can just turn around and say, this is fake news, just like that hit in Ukraine.
Well,
so I can't see how this is going to help them.
Not at all. Well, if there was a D notice on all of that, Annie, we've just broken it. So I'll request a cell next to yours. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. 0344 499 1000. Let's hear from the first caller, Joshua in London. Go ahead, Joshua.
Oh, hi, George. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you.
I was just wondering, George, with this new SNP's renewal of independence after promising they'd drop it until the Brexit process.
Yeah, once in a lifetime, they told us it was going to be.
Yes, I know.
Once in the lifetime of a small insect.
Yes, well, they were never done telling us that. But what are your thoughts on it now? Do you think this political landscape has at all changed, even though we haven't even had another election to tell us what the Scottish people think? I mean, any further developments do you think that have redefined it in any sort of way, or do you think it's just SNP bashing out their old rhetoric?
Well, it is that. It is that. Of course, they exist only for that purpose, to break up this small island, to partition this small island, all the while saying, most of them, that they want to end the partition of another small island quite near to us. So some islands they want partitioned, some islands they want departitioned. I just don't want partition in any small islands, call me old-fashioned. But I don't share your premise, because it's my position that the Scottish people have a right to hold a referendum on independence any time that they like, and however often as they like. Though, of course, anyone introducing one too often will pay a political price for the ennui which would undoubtedly descend amongst the electorate. And the only way we can tell whether the Scottish people want another referendum is by the Scottish Parliament, elected by the Scottish people, telling us. So my position is, whenever the Scottish Parliament calls a referendum, they must have the right to hold it. But I have seen nothing that would change my mind, although I'm not a voter in Scotland nowadays. And I believe the Scottish people, very careful with money as we are, would vote the same way, and probably with a larger majority, not to partition this island so that we could join a European Union that is busily going down the plugs, so that we could leave Liverpool for Latvia. I don't think the Scots will vote for that.
No, well, I'm not actually against one, George. I hope you don't think I'm trying to deprive the Scottish people of their will. If they want a referendum, they want independence, and they should.
Yeah, sure.
Have it.
No, I wasn't, but it's just I don't need any change in landscape. I don't need any development which allows them to hang the coat of a new referendum on. My position is Scotland is a nation. It has an inalienable right to self-determination. Self-determination means that they can choose whether to be an independent state or remain in a multinational state called Britain. They have that right. It's inalienable. No one can take it away from them. And so whenever they want to have a go again, I'm up for it myself. I'm quite good at referenda. I usually win them.
No, well, in regards to the EU, George, do you think that anything in the EU that is, well, I'm not saying it's changed significantly. Is there anything in the EU that do you think that would appeal to your average Scotsman or Scotswoman? You know, do you think there's anything about it right now that would really reel them in right now?
No, on the contrary, not if they look at Greece, if they look at Italy, if they look at Spain, if they look at Portugal, if they look at the crisis in the Eurozone, if they look at the extent to which the euro, the single currency, is deliberately constructed to benefit Germany's economy at the expense of everyone else's. And that's before I start on the other freedoms, so-called. I've always believed, unless Scotland changed a very great deal since I left it in 2005, and I don't believe that it has, then the idea that Scotland is just aching to have free movement of foreign labour into the country, the free movement that will henceforth be denied in England and Wales, is fatuous. I never met Scots who want all of Latvia to come to Scotland and compete for work there, drive down wages there, drive up rents there, put pressure on public services there. And secondly, if you join the European Union as an independent country, you have to adopt the euro. The idea of the Scottish people abandoning the pound for the euro is ridiculous. The Scots are already in a single market. It's called Britain. And most of Scotland's trade is with the rest of Britain, not with Latvia. And I just don't believe Scots, canny people as they are, would make that leap into the dark. And that's all before we look at the new report which has been produced, I forget the name of it now, which presages massive cuts to public expenditure in Scotland. And Scotland is overly dependent on the public sector, as are other deprived and under-economically developed parts of Britain. And that's gone down like a lead balloon. So for me, if they want a new referendum, I say bring it on. And I will fight against it as I did last time, with some success, I think.
Well, I think that maybe you've got a point there, George. Maybe we, the unionists, I know that we're not united on a lot of other issues.
Yeah, well, the only unionist I am, Joshua, is a member of the Transport and General Workers Union. I don't care about what a state is called. I don't care what the constitutional formalities are. I believe in a democratic state. And if the Scottish people want to change their status, they can democratically decide to do so any time that they like. I stand for the rights of the working people, and I don't believe the rights of Scottish working people will be bettered. I believe they'll be worsened by Scotland leaving the British state.
Yeah, no, well, no, that's what I was saying though. If the pro-Britain cause wants to be the new yes, then maybe we should just let them have this referendum. Just say, go on then, let's have it. We don't want to be the oppressors.
It would be good if the referendum allowed us to be yes this time. If the question was, do you want to remain a member of Britain? Yes or no? Then I could be on the road saying, just say yes. I'd like that. Joshua, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much, as always. Phil and Sid Riley in Birkenhead says, "Hi George, it's brilliant to have you back on a Friday evening." I understand there was a bit of a hiccup last Friday evening because a lot of people had been unaware that I'd been on all week, 5 days, in the morning show, and therefore precluded from being on in the evening on Friday, because you're not allowed to present two shows in the same day, though I was, of course, willing to do so. But it meant that the chap who was in here last Friday night had a difficult time at the beginning of his show because most of the audience were looking for me. 0344 499 1000, that's the number to call. You call us, we'll call you back, put you on the radio. Needn't cost you more than a penny or two. Or you can email me, text me, or tweet me at George Galloway at talkRADIO. Now, as I said in my introduction, I raised my metaphorical hat to a man I have never praised before. I thought that Lord Howard, the Right Honourable Michael Howard, former leader of the Conservative Party, spoke truth to power in Parliament this week when he bearded Benjamin Netanyahu in the Parliament session that he held. I'm not sure which room it was in, or even if my guest was there, but I'm sure that, like me, he will have been, well, encouraged that at least somebody in the Conservative Party, and an eminent Conservative at that, is ready to speak truth to Netanyahu as the blood flows at the Gaza fence. And my guest is the premier, not just Premier League, but the premier Conservative columnist and all-round sage, Peter Oboune of the Daily Mail. Peter, thanks for joining us. We used to say, or rather Anne Widdecombe did, that there was something of the night about Michael Howard, but he certainly gave a nightmare to Netanyahu this week.
Yes, one of the ironies about this is that you will remember that some of the attacks on Michael Howard, I'm not saying the one you just mentioned, but some of them were definitely anti-Semitic. He was the first Jewish leader of the Conservative Party after Netanyahu, after Disraeli,
yes,
who had actually converted to Christianity by the time he became leader. And so he's a Jewish leader of the Conservative Party who suffered from anti-Semitic attacks by Tony Blair's Labour Party when he was Tory leader.
And by Tory MPs. Let me tell you, Peter, sorry to interrupt,
yes.
a Conservative MP now deceased said to me, it's an old saw, but he said it to me, that there are not enough Etonians in the Conservative Party front bench, too many Estonians.
Indeed, that was under Maggie Thatcher, when she, Nigel Lawson, Naomi Britton, a lot of her stellar performers were Jewish, and that was, there was definitely anti-Semitism in the Conservative Party, and Michael Howard had to fight that. He was not only was he Jewish, he was Welsh, and he was lower middle class. He had a lot of things he had to deal with, and he became actually, I believe, a great leader of the Tory Party. And to see him today, I've watched that clip, as you obviously have, of standing up at Policy Exchange and confronting Netanyahu about the killing of Palestinians, the murderers, you might well, Palestinians, and saying, why did you have to kill them? Weren't other means available? I mean, he was very, very impressive, I felt, and I put, I'm afraid, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, to shame.
Well, she was there grinning with him on the step at number 10. But I think that Michael Howard spoke for Britain. This is a question on everyone's lips. Why?
Indeed, he spoke to Britain in a way which, The Guardian has failed to do.
Utterly, yeah.
And the Conservative Party has totally failed to do. And let's honour and raise a glass tonight to Michael Howard, who's been accused of many bad things over his time. But I've always stood up for him in many ways.
You see, the question that he asked is one that everyone must have asked, when you have unarmed demonstrators in a kind of Gandhi-like walk, which people have impressed upon the Palestinians for decades that they should adopt, rather than armed conflict. Take the Gandhi route. Outstretch your arms, show your open hands, and walk. When they did it, they literally are being shot down like animals in the field. More than nearly 14,000 have been wounded. And whatever the death toll is today, it's well over 100 already dead people, including women, including children, and perhaps most iconically, including the young nurse, Razan Najjar, who was actually in her medical coat when she was shot down in the back. Unfortunately, we've lost Peter. It was a slightly dodgy line. We'll try and get him back. Russell says the BBC grudgingly reported that Putin held a 4-hour Q&A session for his nation. Can you see any PM giving the UK public 2 minutes of their time? Well, a year ago we had the general election in Britain. For the preceding 4, nearly 5 weeks, I think, Theresa May completely avoided all contact with the British public whose vote she was seeking. And so the Putin session today, or this week rather, was quite extraordinary. Peter has come back. Peter, I don't know how much you heard of my question.
I'm in Baku in Azerbaijan. By the way, I send greetings to you from Baku. There are many admirers of yours here.
How wonderful!
And when I told them that I was drinking tea with them downstairs and I was had to leave to go and speak to you, they all sent distinguished greetings to you.
How wonderful! I'm touched by that. I've never been to Baku, but it's always been in my life because there was an amazing Congress of the Peoples there in, I think, 1919 or 1920, when the story is that people descended from all parts of the world on Baku for a magnificent international congress. No, what I was saying, Peter, the Palestinians were always being pressed to abandon armed struggle, take the Gandhi route, outstretch your arms, show your empty hands, and just walk for justice. And yet, that's what they've done. And well over 100 have been killed, including women and children. Almost 14,000 of them have been wounded in 6 weeks. And most iconically, perhaps, including Razan Najjar, a nurse in her nurse's suit, shot in the back and killed by a sniper with a telescopic weapon. It is... even Michael Howard and anybody else with any modicum of humanity must be asking the question that Michael Howard asked.
Indeed, and the way that attempts are being made by supporters of Israel to somehow suggest that this extraordinarily brave and admirable young nurse was somehow a terrorist is beyond contempt, actually. It's so upsetting because there are those of us who admire much of what Israel is about. That if you're in Israel itself, a liberal democracy and stands for Western values, and then you shoot dead this angel of mercy and then pretend that somehow she's a terrorist or that it's unthinkable, it's terrible, and that it's not the values which we can subscribe to or support. And something very ugly and dark is going on there.
Peter, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us all the way from Baku in Azerbaijan. You may have to get back here quickly, Peter, because the government might fall before your business there is finished, and you may have to report on yet another British general election. It's all going pear-shaped back here in London. Peter Oboune of the Daily Mail and many other places. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I've just got my expensive cologne. I was several days out of it, and I'll tell you, I didn't like it at all. It's Paco Rabanne Purple. For those that are interested, I've worn it for 30 years or more, though other brands are available. Now, a complete maniac called Silencia tweets, "Shame on you for praising Howard. Clearly you have lost the plot. How many other Palestinian tragedies did this Jew not comment on? Shame on you." No, shame on you, you ignorant, anti-Semitic half-wit. Silencia, let there be silence. Block them if they're on my Twitter, please. Let's hear from Dee in Dulwich. Go ahead, Dee.
Hello, George. Hi.
Nice to hear from you.
George, yeah, and you. Listen, I've got a dilemma. I was a Corbyn fan. Hope to be still. Hope to want to vote for him. And I'm really, really puzzled. I think I did mention this to you before in a short phone call, but I really want to vote. The problem is that I'm a Brexiteer. I was a Corbyn fan before he became elected, actually, as leader there. And always...
I was a Corbyn fan until he got elected.
Yeah, well,
Go ahead.
I don't know. It seems to me you're still a Corbyn fan. And the thing is that all I wanted to do is to come clean and have the guts, have the bees to say, look, Brexit is Brexit and I'm going to do it. Instead, he and Keir Starmer are becoming like lovers. It's almost like the Blair people have taken over. And when I last spoke to you, you said, he's going to come clean later. It's just that he's biding his time because, he's got to do it. And it made me look down on him even more. Why can't he come clean? He's not worse than the May thing, the May creature.
Because it's the job of the leader of the opposition to make life as difficult for the leaders of the government as possible. In the hope, I'll let you back in, Dee, let me answer though, in order to bring down the government and force a new general election. That's his principal number one job. Now, he has no responsibility to make the passage of a Brexit, which is not a Labour Brexit, more easy than it would otherwise be. After all, if Theresa May can't persuade her own Tory MPs to vote, or even cabinet ministers to support her Tory Brexit, why would you expect the Labour opposition to do it? I think that Corbyn has played a blinder on the Brexit issue. However, on this, you and I are one. At the final moment, Britain will either Brexit or it will not Brexit. And if it fails to Brexit as a result of Labour votes in Parliament, then you and I will be in the same position. We'll be ex-Corbyn supporters, because the second most important task of Jeremy Corbyn is to ensure that the democratic decision made by the British people in the referendum to Brexit is, in the end, implemented. But up till now, all these parliamentary battles have been handled brilliantly by him, especially when you take into account that sitting behind him are literally hundreds of people who are trying to destroy him and trying to strike poses and undermine and subvert Corbyn at every turn. So he's done all that standing at the front with his foes in front of him and his enemies behind him. I think he's done really well in those circumstances, Dee.
I don't deny what you said. Of course, some of it's true. He's in a position and he's got to carry through. You've just said that his priority is bringing down the government. Surely his priority, because the thing is, it will be too late when it comes to bringing down the government. It might
happen next week, Dee. He might bring down the government next week.
Well, what you're saying is by Tuesday, because that's when or is it next Thursday, they're going to have the vote. And if he doesn't come clean then it's too late.
The meaningful vote on which Labour will have to support Brexit is the meaningful vote on the final terms. These votes coming up this week are a legitimate means of bringing the government down, and that's his number one job. That's what tens of millions of British people are willing him to do. That's what all the people suffering under the Tories are desperate for him to do.
Most of those people that want to bring the government down are Blairites, and they don't want Brexit. And by the time he comes clean, Brexit will be. There's nothing we can do.
I promise you, Dee. I promise you that the poor in the north, in the southwest, in the south of London, where you are, the poor all over this country, the struggling all over this country, the just about managing all over this country, are desperate to bring the government down.
But they're abandoning Corbyn because there'll be a new UKIP. If he doesn't help, there'll be UKIP, and I'm almost tempted to vote for them. Although I hold my
Well, you'll
nose.
not be voting for UKIP because they will have disappeared by the time of the next election, and it's very unlikely that a new UKIP is going to emerge in time for the next general election if the government falls this week.
Right, but if Brexit doesn't happen, there'll be a UKIP.
Yes, for sure. For sure. And it's unlikely that I could ever support anything called UKIP. But I regard Brexit as an article of faith. And if Labour in the end betrays it, then I'll no longer be Labour. I'll no longer be Corbyn.
True. So to sum up, what you're saying is that he's got to bring the government down as a priority, and Brexit comes down the line then.
It comes second. What I said, if you listen back to it, is that Brexit is second. His first duty is to bring down the government and force a general election. His second duty is to see implemented the decision of the British people to leave the European Union. Everything else comes after that.
And you support him on that then, George?
Totally. Of course, if I was in Parliament, I'd be doing my best to bring down the government, to force them to go to the polls.
Right.
I'm glad, actually, they've moved ahead in the opinion polls. That might tempt them into a general election. But then there were 21 points ahead this time last year, or rather a couple of weeks earlier, and look what happened.
Yeah. Well, he had a good Wednesday during question time.
Oh, he's beating her. He's beating her every week now.
But I don't know.
She's a pitiful creature, don't you think?
Well, I'm beginning to think Corbyn's match. That's my problem. I really do need your assurance. I'm glad
you've
I got some
it.
of it.
You've got my assurance.
Right.
And
Okay,
if we're both let down, we'll both be standing shoulder to shoulder somewhere.
Won't it? He'd have joined Keir Starmer, which I can't see the difference between him and Keir Starmer now. I really can't.
Don't get me started on him. I never know what he said because I always fall asleep after the first couple of paragraphs.
Well, basically,
even on a Sunday morning.
He's saying what Al Campbell's saying. He's saying what the Adonis creature is saying.
Yeah, sure. But he's not calling the shots. In the end, the shot will have to be called by Corbyn. And I'm perfectly sure, having known Corbyn for almost 40 years, and more importantly than that, knowing that 70% of Labour-held constituencies voted for Brexit, Corbyn will have to vote for Brexit. Dee in Dulwich, pleasure always to talk with you. We've got Kevin Marr coming up on the Irish question quite soon, but let me read a few of the written materials. Chris says, if our leaders had an ounce of morality, they would make it crystal clear that evil crimes such as this in Gaza wouldn't be tolerated and will be severely punished. At least I'm inferring that's in Gaza, Chris. Forgive me if I've got that wrong. Hassan says, I love Alice Cooper, Poison. Thanks for playing the splash. Well, it wasn't my choice. Now, I mustn't read out one of my own tweets. Filza says, thanks, George. You always raise your voice against Israeli snipers and speak for innocent, defenseless Palestinians. You are a gem. Where others fail, you win. Thank you, my dear. And Man Like Mike says, an excellent introduction as ever, George. Another person was shot dead last night, 5 minutes from my house in Liverpool. This chaos is a crimson blanket descending across the whole country. But there are too many fools who hate Jezza to change things. I must say I'm astounded. I mean, that news item that we've just heard, 100-year-old woman was murdered for her handbag, and she's just passed away. I saw a picture earlier today of a 90-year-old woman in London lying, clinging to life, whose house was burgled and who was mercilessly beaten. I saw a picture of a guy jump off his bicycle in Croydon and pull a gigantic knife. They call them zombie knives. And he was smashing it on a driver's window, trying to break the window so he could murder the man inside the car. I saw another picture today from the North Circular of people climbing on top of people's cars that were stopped in the traffic jams and going in the sunroof with knives and guns and machine guns. And where is the mayor? Look, I was also in favour of pedestrianising the Oxford Street. I would also like to see more women, more blacks, more ethnic minorities using these ultra-expensive cycle lanes that we've invested so much money and have caused so much chaos in London. It would be nice to see more people cycling and more diverse people cycling. That would be nice. But if I was the mayor in the midst of this crime wave and the summer has just started, I'd be doing nothing else, speaking about nothing else. I'd be nowhere else except on the front line with the decimated police force, shouting from the rooftops for more police and better intelligence about this crime wave. And it astounds me that he's not doing that, Sadiq Khan. It astounds me that the Home Secretary is not there with him doing that. I tell you, people in Brent, notwithstanding the statement I read out last week from the police chief in Brent, are terrified that they are going to be next, that their children are going to be caught up in a hail of machine gun bullets. Yes, machine gun bullets. 18 bullets fired at one man from an automatic weapon in London in 2018. Has the mayor been in? Has the Home Secretary been in? If they were, I missed them.
From the fence with electricity sting.
What a great find, what a great pick. Well done, that man or woman that found that. Well, of course, Ireland was a country where there, in the comparatively recent past, there were many men behind the wire, and there was indeed a border that was not just wire, but huge towers, fortresses of British armed forces, the hardest possible border, and a very dangerous one at that. Thankfully, the Good Friday Agreement put an end to that period in Ireland's troubled history with Britain. But things are really heating up, I can tell. And for two reasons. First of all, the ineluctable demographic and political march towards majority support in the 6-county statelet that some call Northern Ireland is changing profoundly the balance of political opinion. And a new survey out today, which I've only just skimmed, I'm going to dig more deeply into it, shows just how profoundly things are changing. And the second reason is that, beholden as she is to the Democratic Unionist Party, clinging to power as she is, from the tassels of their orange sashes, she is incapable of making the only logical decision that would solve the Brexit customs conundrum of drawing the boundary, the border between Britain and Ireland and Britain and the EU in the middle of the Irish Sea, which is where it should have been all along. Now, Kevin Marr is the author of A United Ireland and frequently our informed, indeed exceptionally informed guest here on the show. And he joins me again now. Kevin, thanks.
Good evening, George.
I interrupted your holiday last time. Forgive me for that.
That's quite all right. That's quite all right.
I hope you're closer to home and on a clear line. Let's talk about the first thing first, Kevin. The survey that I referred to. Tell us what's in it, would you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a survey out today that's been quite widely covered, which is showing, it's asking people in Northern Ireland, do they want to see a united Ireland? Could they live with one? How do they feel in terms of their Irishness, their Britishness? And there's been a series of surveys over the last year or so, I think very much in the context of Brexit and how that is perhaps changing opinion in the centre ground, if you like, of Northern Irish society. People who are perhaps soft nationalists or soft unionists, perhaps don't vote for Sinn Féin, perhaps don't vote for the DUP, somewhere in the middle. It's interesting to see how these people are interpreting the future, because, of course, any referendum on Northern Ireland's constitutional status and whether there's a united Ireland will be swung by these people. They would be very important. This poll today shows, a really sharp narrowing of the divide around questions around Irish unity and questions of Irishness. A lot of Protestants in Northern Ireland are obviously seen traditionally as kind of monolithically British. Actually, their sense of self-identity is shifting, it's changing, it's much more nuanced than perhaps it was in the past. It's not the unionism necessarily of banging the lambic drum and marching down the street in an orange sash, as you mentioned a few minutes ago. This is a university educated generation, perhaps more socially liberal, perhaps more rational, perhaps more perhaps with people with friends across the sectarian divide, and of course have grown up against the backdrop of 20 years of peace and relative stability, thanks to the Good Friday Agreement. So the pieces are in flux in Northern Irish society. This poll today shows that. I have to sort of point out there was a poll a few weeks ago that actually showed Britishness being fairly solid amongst Northern Ireland Protestants. So depending on how you ask the question, depending on how you measure it, some of these polls show slightly different things. But I think the trend over the last year very much has been, particularly with younger people, younger voters, that they can see, I think, what's coming with Brexit. They can see that that's perhaps a threat to their sense of identity. 56% of people in Northern Ireland voted to stay in the European Union. So there's a lot. The politics of the place and the social attitudes of the place are different, I think, distinctly different than they are in Britain. And Brexit is making them ask, can we live in a single Irish state if that means that we stay members of the European Union and the benefits that have accrued to Northern Ireland as a result of that. And I think perhaps people are saying, what do I want? Well, I would like to, if I'm a unionist, I would like to stay part of Britain, but what can I live with? I can live with being part of Ireland because I feel Irish, I like Irish poetry, I like the Irish landscape. I may consider myself British as well, but I also consider a dimension of my identity to be Irish, and increasingly so. And I think that's, for me, one of the very interesting points, because as you say, I think there is an almost magnetic pull to this point where not only do we get a referendum on Northern Ireland's constitutional status, I think, certainly within a decade, I think perhaps much sooner than that. And I think when that vote comes, I think it will be catalytic, and I think there will be a lot of people who may be, as I say, in the centre ground, who will move towards Irish reunification, and I think it will cross the threshold of 50% plus one, and I think it'll be significantly more than that, actually.
Yeah, me too. But one straw in the wind as to how concerned about that the traditional unionist politicians are, is that Peter Robinson was in the media today saying that 50% plus one would not be enough. He wants to move the goalposts.
This is it. The Good Friday Agreement is slightly kind of elliptical on this point, but all the understanding has been, look, if there's a demand for a border poll, as it's called, a referendum, if that's demonstrably the case because, Sinn Féin tops the poll in terms of the next Assembly elections, for example. That would be a strong indicator. If there were more people who voted for parties that support Irish unity, Sinn Féin and the SDLP and perhaps others, if there was a majority of people in Northern Ireland that voted for those parties, I think it would be very difficult for the British government not to grant a border poll. And of course, if that border poll is held on all the bases on which we hold referendums, in our political culture, a majority is a majority is a majority. Brexit is taking place on the back of support of 52% of the population, and that result, as I see it, has got to be honoured. If we look back to the creation of the Welsh Assembly back in 1998. 50.5% of people in Wales voted to have a Welsh Assembly. Again, it was absolutely on a knife edge. But of course, the vote is a majority and the vote stands. And I think it will be inconceivable that you could have a situation where a majority of people in Northern Ireland voted for Irish reunification, and that result
was then denied.
upheld.
Yeah.
I think that will be a crazy position to allow ourselves to be in. There's in fact a legal challenge taking place, George, at the moment in the High Court to try and give some better definition around how that border poll will be called. It's in the gift of the Northern Ireland Secretary in the Good Friday Agreement. But of course, there's a welter of factors that will be taken into consideration, and you can't ignore the way that people vote in terms of the support for the party. So I think it will happen as a border poll. I think when you start putting caveats in, saying, well, look, it's got to be 2/3 support or 60% or whatever, then we end up in a legal minefield because, of course, by that stage, people will be saying, right, well, we need another vote on Brexit then.
Now, look, Kevin, just because we're short of time, let me move on to the second issue of the Brexit negotiations and how Ireland impacts them and how Brexit impacts Ireland. The European Union are obviously seeking to exploit the tension that exists on this issue, and probably pretty effectively. And I see that the Irish Prime Minister was in Belfast this week, visiting an Orange Lodge, as well as opening the Belfast Festival. Tell us how that's all playing, will you?
Certainly. I mean, just on the last point, Leo Varadkar, the Irish Taoiseach, an openly gay man who's half Indian. He breaks lots of molds in lots of respects, and he's been very keen, I think, to.
He must have been real welcome in the Orange Lodge. It's one of those strange curiosities that he's there, and fair play to the Orange Lodge for inviting him, and fair play to him for going, because of course you've got to get some unity, social unity as much as political unity. But on the question again of Brexit, again the Irish border issue was seen by Theresa May all those months ago at the start of the Brexit negotiations as the easy bit. That's easy to resolve. That's just the border with Ireland. We'll sort that out. And of course, here we are all the way through this process, and it's not been resolved. It's not been resolved to the satisfaction of the Irish government, who are backed absolutely in lockstep with the European Commission and Michel Barnier, the EU's negotiator. There's not a cigarette paper between the Irish position and the European position, because of course they are the same. This is a border between the British state and the Irish Republic, but it's also a border between Britain and the European Union, a 310-mile border, which is incredibly difficult to police and maintain, not just in security terms, but also in terms of customs and tariffs and what have you. And you spoke at the intro there, George, about the border and the Irish Sea. And of course, what this means is that rather than institute a hard border arrangement for tariffs and customs, and of course, it would need a lot of security to be maintained, don't do that and actually have Northern Ireland effectively given special status. It's part of the European Union for customs purposes, possibly for single market access. But of course, Northern Ireland still remains part of the UK until such a time that there's that border poll, as I say, that comes from the Good Friday Agreement. So it's frankly, looking at this, it's not a biggie. For Unionists, this looks like you've removed the border, and it looks very much like a united Ireland. And of course, it is in terms of customs and tariffs and what have you. But this should not impede where we are in terms of Britain trying to get the best deal it possibly can out of the European Union in the few weeks and months that we've got left of this negotiation. We really are running up against the wires here,
And Northern Ireland is, 3% of the UK's population. It's 1.5% of the UK's economy. This is not just the tail wagging the dog. This is the stump of the tail wagging the dog.
The tip of the tail,
the idea that we're all going to suffer in Britain because we have a hard cliff edge and all the problems that may come out of Brexit, simply to appease the Democratic Unionists and their kind of, sort of high principle that Northern Ireland should be identical to the UK. Now, of course, Northern Ireland is very different. It's governed very differently. Everything from, as we've seen in recent days, from abortion laws right the way through to its water industry. Everything is very different in Northern Ireland in the way it's governed. So really, Theresa May should have said to Arlene Foster, said to the DUP, said to unionism months ago, look, guys, we cannot have you impeding the Brexit negotiations for the whole of Britain, because you will not be forgiven if Britain gets a bad deal out of Brexit simply to save the blushes of Arlene Foster and the DUP.
I'm not sure they do blush in the DUP, but Kevin Marr, thank you very much indeed. Author of A United Ireland, well worth a read if you haven't already got it yet. This is the mother of all talk shows. Now, Dennis Rodman is a good friend of mine. And if you'd told me years ago, when Dennis was in all kinds of scrapes, that he'd be going to a summit as a friend of both negotiators involving the President of the United States and the President, or leader rather, of North Korea, I'd have thought you were crazy. But that's where Dennis is headed. Lock up your daughters in Singapore is all I can say. There's also quite a bit of busting up going on between Donald Trump and the other leaders of the G7, not least because Donald Trump has opined that the G7 should be the G8 and Russia should be brought back into the fold. It's all throwing normal political lines out of shape. People on the left are denouncing Trump as an agent of Russia, and people on the right are rubbishing the left for Russophobia. Well, one man with very firm views on all of these and the eloquence to express them is Michael Graham, my talkRADIO co-host, and he's on the line in the US, I hope. Michael, welcome.
George, I'm your talkRADIO photo negative. I mean, if you took the opposite of you and made it alive, it would probably be me when it comes to ideology.
Well, that's the wonder of democratic free speech, isn't it?
Yes, it absolutely is. It is. And I'm thrilled to be with you here. And I just want to remind the people of the UK that Donald Trump has one audience, and it's the 48% of American voters who are willing to vote for him, possibly for re-election. And he doesn't care how much Trudeau squeals. He doesn't care how much Macron whinges. He's talking straight to the people who, for whatever reason, feel like America's been getting the short end of the stick.
Maybe he even enjoys it. I don't mean he's a sadist wanting people to squeal, but the more they squeal, the more that plays to his audience of 48%.
Because, and I think he's completely wrong on the issue. A trade is a good thing. Trade makes everybody more, broadly speaking, more prosperous. You can find individual losers, but the economy as a whole, the wealth of the nation as a whole goes up. But there is this audience of people who feel like that the job of America since World War II has been to clean up everyone's messes for you in, for example, Europe, hint, hint, and then get kicked in the cantaloupes when we're done by, ingrates and progressives. And so they like to see Donald Trump pointing out, for example, that Canada has a $151 billion, the EU has a $151 billion trade surplus. They're wrong that hurts us, but at least they feel like their voice is being heard.
Now, he's playing a blinder on that front. And as you say, Macron is whining and Trudeau is squealing, and his poll ratings are going up, aren't they?
Yeah, they're inching up. I mean, you have to be careful, in my opinion, about what numbers you look at, because there are some pollsters who have they use a model that for whatever reason benefits Trump, and they tend to be Republican leaning. There are some other pollsters, particularly in the media, who hate Trump so much that they're constantly tweaking their numbers to drive them down. But the fact is, he is probably about where he was when he won the election, because one of the things that I've had the good fortune working with some pollsters over here, like Kristen Soltis Anderson, who does an excellent polling of younger voters, and the folks at Suffolk University in Boston, who are outstanding pollsters. And they say it's interesting. There's been a myth in the past that Republicans underpoll, that in fact, when you actually look at the numbers, they tend to come in close to what you thought they would have based on the aggregate of the polls. But Trump does seem to have a 2 to 3% hidden vote because the social pressure,
shy
George,
Trumpers, yeah.
Exactly. Well, when we think about it, the social pressure over here is enormous. If you're in a place like me, I'm in blue state Boston as a Republican. I mean, it's crushing you. It's not enough simply to not praise Trump. You have to denounce Trump with every fiber of your being. And in that climate, it's easy for people to keep their opinions to themselves. So you add that 2 or 3% to his 44% approval rating, and that's pretty much the Trump that got elected.
Well, it's not long ago that we were predicting that the Republicans would be routed at the midterm elections. No one's predicting that now, are they?
If you're someone who follows British politics and not American politics, I cannot tell you what a shockwave this has been for the political universe over here. It's, people who, if you have a casual knowledge, Bill Clinton got elected, and then 2 years later, the Republicans take control of the Congress for the first time in a generation. Obama gets elected. First midterm, he loses 64, I believe it was, seats. One of the biggest. He called it a shellacking. This is just what Americans do, and maybe it's buyer's remorse. Maybe it's that once one party has control, their voters kind of stay home because they feel, they're not motivated. Trump, right now, if the election were held today, it is down, according to CBS News polling, 1 or 2 seats as to whether the Republicans will hold the House. It would be a miracle. It would be a bigger shock than Trump winning the White House if Republicans can hold the Congress. And if that happens, George, I think people like me have to stop saying that the Trump moment is just kind of a moment. It's one of those things, things happen and nations go through fevers, whatever. And I think you have to admit there's some sort of realignment going on. And I think it's true as an outside observer on Brexit. I think the most significant number about Brexit is how the support for Brexit has generally stayed solid, despite the horrible mishandling by Theresa May, despite the nonstop media pounding on the idea that Brexit has idiotic on its face. The support number has stayed relatively solid.
Absolutely. I've just been looking at it. I've just been looking at it. The people who voted leave, 87% of them believe that it was right, and the people that voted remain, 87% of them believe it was wrong. Nothing changed. It's extraordinary. We're in the same place as we were when we Brexiteers triumphed against all the odds.
So why do you think it is? What is that force that you think? I think there's a commonality between the Trump moment over here and Brexit.
Absolutely, yes.
What do you think it is?
It's hatred of the establishment, the experts, the political class, the media class, the people who talk down to others, who care or seem to care little about how life is lived in flyover country, in your country, and in the post-industrial deserts of the north and the south east and southwest of Britain, amongst the people who've been left behind. And I think the Trump victory spoke to them and for them, and the Brexit victory also spoke to them and for them.
I have a slightly different take, and I say this as someone, I grew up in the rural South. My parents are both blue collar. I have a very lousy education from a really crummy college. And so I've grown up thinking that there were these elites, in your case, Cambridge, our case, Ivy League, people, and then they know what they're doing and they're super smart. And if you just listen to them, that they'll manage things and then it'll be fine. And I think that in the last 15 years in particular, it has become patently obvious that they have had no idea what the hell they're doing.
Yeah.
And I mean, look for example at the EU experiment. Maybe it can work in theory, maybe it can't. But when you look at the devastation of places, I say devastation. You look at the situation with places like Italy, Portugal, Greece, Ireland for a while. You can't say that anybody who knew what the hell they were doing would have done that.
Yeah, quite.
It's awful. It's massive debt. It's no real growth. It's undermining local commitment in their own institutions. They've turned people into divided citizens at a time when their own nation needs them the most. And this was the super genius plan. And then over here in America, you have the strata of people who are getting super wealthy, which I, for one, don't begrudge them at all, but no thought about, how are you going to break through and create opportunity for these other communities? And the answer was always, just shut up. We're smarter than you. We know what you're doing. Sit down and shut up. And that was on the Republican and Democratic side.
Yeah,
and I think honest people can look at the management of our cultures and our economies the past 15 or 20 years and say whoever was in charge stunk. They stunk the joint up. And and on the flip side of that, George, I think if it had been managed better, if you had real general across-the-board prosperity, if you didn't have these stupid mistakes, whether it was open borders in America or the idiotic call for 1 million new migrants from the heart of jihad country into Europe, if you hadn't had those things, those stupid things, I don't know that there'd be as much anger. I think the anger in many ways is well earned by the people who perceive themselves as the angels to govern us. Well, Thomas Jefferson told us 200 years ago, there are no angels to govern you. There's only you, the people.
Well, I wish we had longer to explore these because we are finding some unexpected common ground. But let me ask finally, Mike, and I'm grateful for your time, is the Dennis Rodman, my old pal, standing there towering over little Kim and cheek by jowl with Donald. Is it going to work, do you think? Is Singapore going to work, or will they just eat out McDonald's in the Singapore High Street and that'll be it?
I think Dennis Rodman will show them a good time on the town. I think you can count on that.
He'll lead them into trouble if they allow it. I promise you. He used to invite me regularly to his beach house in Santa Monica, but I knew that no good could come of that.
Well, I have spent some time in Santa Monica. CBS studios are there, and I've spent some time in beach houses there, and you're generally right. To me, the fact that we should all keep our eyes on, there's no sane reason why the Kim regime would give up nukes. Nukes completely changed their math. All they want to do is stay in power. The only way that they can guarantee that they can keep such a vile regime that treats its own people so horribly and stay in power, in this modern moment, is if they have nukes as their backstop. He's never going to negotiate those away. Maybe you can get some better treatment, some better attitudes. Maybe you can get him to limit the distance of his missiles, something like that. Maybe you can even get him to limit the number of nukes. But he's always going to keep nuclear power because that's the only way the regime can guarantee its survival.
So even the great deal maker won't be able to make that
There's
deal.
no deal. There's no deal to be made, because what could he possibly offer that gives Kim more security than the ability to say, if you try regime change, I'll set off a nuke. That's the trump card. There's nowhere else to go beyond that.
Michael Graham, a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much indeed. American broadcaster Michael Graham, one of my talk radio colleagues, and as he put it, the photo reverse image of me. Now, a number of people, myself included, have begun to get worried and then suspicious about the fact that ever since I interviewed her, making her a radio superstar, I have not heard the dulcet tones of I'm Robin Finlay. But hey, as we passed on those concerns, she replied with this message. This is a message from I'm Robin Finlay. Hello! Ha! That's so lovely of their concern. I saw some tweets. Nothing sinister. Just been on different shifts for a bit. They change from time to time. Also away on holiday tomorrow, so I'm not sure when I'll be back in the evenings. Hopefully soon. Hope everyone your way is doing well. Well, on behalf of all my listeners, Robin. We wish you a very happy holiday, but a speedy return to this particular parish. Patrick says, thanks for the focus, George. I didn't realise how bad violence is in the UK. Maybe consideration should be given to instructing the army to support the police in sorting out the problems. Better that than get them involved supporting NATO and the head choppers. Good point, Patrick, but it's not necessary. We ought to be replacing the 21,000 police officers that have been lost since this government came to power in 2010. 21,000 officers missing in the middle of a crime wave. You couldn't make it up. Fra says it's time to delegitimize Israel, deconstruct Zionism and dismantle the Israeli apartheid regime built on stolen land, broken bones, mass incarceration, illegal occupation, and maintained by brute force. Damien says, just curious, if the Judas Brigade inside the Labour Party were flushed out and you were asked to run again, would you? Seems to me you'd serve the British public better in the seat you're sitting in now than one in Westminster, telling the true story. Good question, and at least a very thoughtful answer to your own question. Thanks, Damien, for that. If the Judas Brigade were flushed out, well, if my auntie had a beard, she'd be my uncle. Terry Eaton says, George, if we criticise Israel, we are branded as anti-Semitic, which is not true, but we are anti-Israeli terrorism, and the world should be doing something about the murder in Gaza of innocent Palestinians. Patrick says, thanks. No, I've done that one. And I've done that one. Tad says, haven't heard from Tad for a wee while. Welcome, Tad. He says, the Telegraph reports that it isn't just the British people who are thoroughly fed up with Theresa May. President Trump is said to be annoyed by her schoolmistress approach and will not be holding direct talks with Mrs. May at the G7. Only the grey and dour John Major could do a worse job. We need a leader at this time, not a grammar school prefect. Well, I have a high opinion of John Major, and I promise you, I knew John Major. John Major was a friend of mine. Theresa May ain't no John Major. And Chris says, to lecture Russia about so-called interference after our disastrous meddling in Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya surely is the definition of hypocrisy. And Mark in Plovdiv in Bulgaria, a very important town in my history, says, easy to resolve the issue of the Irish border, let the island reunite. Simple but perfect. And Thomas says, hi George, Theresa May is as useless as a blocked drain in a flood. That's from Thomas in Camden. Fra, I've done that one. Mark from London says, why do well-educated middle-class intellectuals like you and Damien from Brighton look down and sneer at working-class men in England? P.S. Will you be supporting England in the World Cup? I've got to laugh. I know nothing about Damien's education and class, but for you to call me a well-educated middle-class intellectual, it's just about takes the biscuit. First of all, I'm not well-educated. I was educated making tyres in Michelin in Dundee. I left school as soon as I could. I've never been to university. I have no degree. I have virtually no qualifications. As for middle class, I was born into an attic, a slum, a one-room sloping attic in the Irish quarter of Dundee, and then I moved into the princely dwelling of a council house in the Charleston housing scheme in Dundee, where I lived almost all of my young life. So I'm not well educated, neither am I middle class, and I'm not an intellectual, but I am an agitator of some worth. I am an organizer of some ability, and I have made my mark. Otherwise you, Mark, in London, wouldn't be listening, hanging on my every word. And Frank says, what's happening to The Guardian when the editor, Catherine Viner, pulls a cartoon by Steve Bell criticising the murder by an Israeli sniper of a young girl in Gaza? Catherine Viner is bathing The Guardian in shame. It's up to its neck now in that shame. And soon, I think, it will be so bathed in that shame that it will drown in it. Catherine Viner is a betrayer of everything. And Joe Mears says, George, I'm a former miner and trade union rep. I'm a member of the Labour Party, and I'm disgusted at the way local councillors rubbish Jeremy Corbyn. There is no support here in Chorley at the Labour constituency. In the name of God, get back into politics and stick up for us at the lower end of society. Viva George. Thanks for that, Joe. I appreciate it. My position is, as it's always been, whether or not I go back into the Labour Party, and many people don't want me back in the Labour Party, because if I was back in the Labour Party, I suspect that they think that quite quickly I'd be back in Parliament at a by-election, perhaps. And that's why they don't want me back in the Labour Party. And that may apply to some surprising people too. But whether or not I go back into the Labour Party or back into Parliament, I demand that my unjust, unconstitutional, arguably illegal, but politically absurd expulsion from the Labour Party over the Iraq War be rescinded. You don't even have to put me back in the Labour Party if you don't want, but it's a simple matter of justice. You have to rescind, declare null and void an expulsion that was driven by Tony Blair before we knew that on Iraq I was right and he was wrong. I was telling the truth and he was telling lies. Now, that's all I'm asking. It's my only demand of the Labour Party. And it's really not much to ask, considering that Jeremy Corbyn was outside the expulsion hearing demonstrating in my support. It's really not much to ask, Jeremy. It really, really isn't. And I don't know if it ever occupies your mind, even for a moment, that me and Mark Wadsworth and Ken Livingstone, your friends, your comrades, for decades, more than a century if you put us together, we're all expelled. That just doesn't compute, Jeremy. 0344 499 1000. You've got half an hour left. John in Glasgow's called, and he's on the line now. Go ahead, John.
George, you were mentioning earlier about the crime in London and the political agenda of the mayor, which was more concerned with the colour of cyclists than the crime that's there.
Yeah, and the pedestrianisation of Oxford Street.
That's
Whilst people are running around with large knives in broad daylight.
Yes, but this unfortunately is not simply confined to London. This is something that's rearing its head as well in Britain's third largest city outside London, Glasgow, and its second largest police force, Police Scotland. Glasgow is now, in the last few years, drive-by shootings, people shot at the wheel of their cars, and it seems to me that the political landscape. You've mentioned obviously police numbers, which is an aspect of it, but I think that a large part of this is disarray and lack of willpower, both from the mayor in London and the political landscape of the SNP up here in Scotland, who have and the police seem to detect that their political masters have other priorities.
Yeah, well, I'm with you on that. I mean, the fish rots from the head, and the buck stops, to mix the metaphor, with the elected leaders. And if the law and order situation is slipping out of control, and I promise you in London, it has actually now gone beyond that. It is already out of control, as you can see online and in the newspapers, day and daily, hourly, in fact. London already has a record number of murders, and it's only the beginning of June. And if you take stabbings as a whole, there are people going to hospital in London with stab wounds every 60 minutes. 60 minutes of every day.
Yes. Well, I mean, here, certainly in Glasgow, I mean, people perceive that there are spurious priorities. I mean, we have a new SNP control here at Glasgow City Council, and the latest thing is that they want to have shooting galleries in Glasgow. to basically allow people to go in and take drugs under the guise, obviously, to some extent of assisting addicts. But there's a feeling that this is again because drugs is reserved to London and the UK government, that this is again being raised as another avenue of grievance to create conflict there. When in actual fact, if this comes in, they're simply allowing, and a lot of the trouble here is gangland related and to do with drugs, they're simply setting up a business premises for the drug dealers who will simply congregate nearby to sell their product.
Grievance is her middle name. Thanks, John, for that. Richard Thomas says, great show, George. I'm on the late shift driving round Swansea, hanging on every word. Thanks, Richard. Bob says, what G7? Surely the G6. Under May, we stand alone in the world, warring against Russia. Unfortunately, I was exposed to some BBC News output last night. They're still peddling the Russophobic roadshow. They ain't set off for Moscow with their fatigues on yet. It is amazing that our people are headed for Russia for the World Cup. Oh, did I answer that? Have I come to it yet? Did he ask? He asked if I'll be supporting England in the World Cup. No, I'm supporting Egypt. Andy is in Preston. He's on next. Go ahead, Andy.
Hello, Georgia. Thank you for taking my call. It's just 2 points you raised in the last hour about your stance on Northern Ireland and also your stance on how Jeremy Corbyn should behave as an opposition.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to disagree on both counts. In terms of Northern Ireland, the border down the Irish Sea would, in effect, reunify Ireland.
Yeah.
And as I said, I don't object to it in principle, provided the people of Northern Ireland / the 6 counties would like that. But my concern is for the Brexit vote of Northern Ireland.
Can I interrupt you there for a second, Andy? I'll let you back in. There's absolutely no way that Britain can accept a disastrous Brexit deal in order to appease a tiny sliver of the British state's population living in just 6 counties of another country. So if you're saying to me that we should be prepared to go off the edge of a cliff with the worst possible Brexit deal to rescue the blushes of the DUP, I say no. And guess what? I think the vast majority of British people would be with me on that.
Right. The absolute solution to the Northern Irish to the Irish issue is I won't be able to give you right now. I'm going to be upfront and honest with you. But the thing is, I mean, I was a Brexiter, but if we're going to, in my opinion, if we're going to let down the percentage of people, 34% of people who voted for Brexit in Northern Ireland, if we're going to say to those people, I'm sorry, you're going to have to go back into the European Union. I'm sorry, but I think that's...
Well, it's a price I'm prepared to pay. It's a price the vast majority of people in Britain and the great majority of people in Ireland are prepared to pay. Anyway, we're not going to agree on that. What was your other point, Andy?
It's not Jeremy Corbyn's stance on... it's about an opposition stance and how they should behave, where I think you said the government... The primary focus is for them to bring the government down. Again, I'm going to disagree. For me, all politicians, whatever you believe in, should be talking from a point of principle. And if there's ever a time when you agree with your enemy, so if say Jeremy Corbyn agreed with,
but he has done that, Andy, already. Labour voted for the principle of triggering Article 50 rather. Labour already voted for that. That's the principle, and the final principle will be. Whether we leave on the meaningful vote when the final terms are known. These are the only 2 votes in principle. The rest is all open for negotiation and parliamentary wrangling. And that's all Corbyn's doing.
Right, my comments really weren't just in terms of Brexit, just in terms of politics together.
As a constitutional principle. Well, the constitutional principle is, the clue's in the name, Andy. They are the opposition. Right, but they're also parliamentarians, and I think if you're a parliamentarian, whether you're a right winger, left winger, whatever you agree, whatever your beliefs are, it's your position to state what you believe personally, not just to
say something in order just to bring the government down.
No, of course. Well, I agree with you. You must never say something you don't believe in, and you must never not say something that you do believe in if you're up on your feet. But these are parliamentary manoeuvres, and this is the government having difficulty with its own side and with the parliamentary numbers that are their fault. Theresa May already had a majority. She threw it away.
Oh, I agree. I think Theresa May. I'll better declare my position. I'm a Labour voter and I'm a Labour member. And yes, Theresa May has done a terrible job. I'm not going to disagree with you there. But even
you can't expect Jeremy Corbyn to rescue her.
No, you're misunderstanding. No, of course, if Jeremy Corbyn has different politics to the Conservatives, obviously, but you should be bringing down a government on a point of principle, not like we just agreed that you say something you don't believe in order to bring them down.
Well, I don't know about you, but I think most people in Preston would be pretty happy if we could get this government out, however we got them out.
Yeah, what are we going to replace it with, though? You see,
a general election, that's what we're going to replace it with.
Yeah, but, I mean, what sort of Labour government are we going to get, though? I mean, my worry is, you said it yourself before, there's a lot of backstabbers in the Labour Party how can Jeremy come and get some of these policies done if he has such a big, massive opposition within his own party?
Well, you're the Labour member, not me, and you're more likely to have the answer to that than me. But thanks very much for your call. It's been a pleasure disagreeing with you. Evening, says Linda. Seen how much the Russian poisoning, so-called, has cost the taxpayer so far. It's a very good point, Linda. There's at least 100 Metropolitan Police officers still in Salisbury when they should be in Brent. Now, Ian Lee, the surreal brilliance of Ian Lee and Flippin' Kath comes up right after me, so don't miss that. Stay tuned to Talk Radio. Fantastic. Both of them are. It doesn't look like so far that there's any extra work for me next week, so I'll be back on Friday, God willing, at 7 o'clock with the mother of all talk shows. But you can find me in plenty of other places, including on Sky 511 tomorrow with my Sputnik show, which deals with a special issue close to my heart, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy 50 years ago this week. I promise you, if you don't even normally watch Sputnik, you should watch that one. And you can find me on lots of other platforms too. The best way is to follow me on Twitter, where they are obviously showcased. Lizzie says, I had so much to say to you tonight, George Galloway, but the fine people on your show have said it all. Fantastic show. Talk Radio, please make it soon when we can attend the University of the Airwaves again. Thank you, Lizzie, for that. And John is in Camden in London. John, welcome.
Good evening, George.
Evening, sir.
A few points I want to raise tonight. First of all, about the Mayor of London, and the burgeoning violent crime. You said, and we have discussed before, that there are 20 to 25 people a day attending hospitals with life-threatening stab wounds.
Yeah, it was your stat. I was just repeating.
Yeah, well, this was a caller to Julia's show a few weeks ago, and it had to be heard to be believed. There is now a burgeoning backstreet cottage industry of people willing to sew people up and superglue up people's wounds because
I know a place where that's happening.
Because if someone is a wanted criminal, the hospital authorities are legally obligated to notify the police.
Yeah, that's what's happening. Yeah. So your 20 to 25, John, is an under-representation of the actual numbers that are being tended
to. People are now attending hospital with septicemia because they have been sewn up with a roll of Silco and had their wounds superglued up. It is vastly underrepresented. And something else which didn't appear on any media outlet was that an Australian film crew at the base of Grenfell Tower were robbed at gunpoint of their equipment on Monday night. Now, this was all over the Australian film network.
My goodness, I haven't seen that in our media.
Well, find it. It's there. It was on the Twitter feed of a London-based radio station, and it was on Australian news network. And the guy's going, London is open, but is it safe? The Mayor Sadiq Khan is unavailable for comment.
Yeah.
The guy was robbed at gunpoint, and this other guy had a machete, and you could hear him saying, give me the camera or I'll chop our hands off. And they rode away with $25,000 worth of media film crew. Yeah, so...
Where is he? Where is the invisible Khan?
Well, this is what I want to say, that he's not been interviewed by you. He's not been interviewed by James or Julia or anybody.
No, he won't come on. He won't come on this station.
He won't come on because he only goes to somewhere, to a particular broadcaster.
Yeah, because
because he gets an easy ride.
Yeah, he plays them as a patsy.
Because it's like an hour of Blairite chumocracy. It's that he will go down. Mr. Khan's legacy, if he stands it again, and if he doesn't get re-elected, what will be his legacy? He presided over the most violent crime wave this city has seen. Now, I fully understand and I fully appreciate the validity of his argument about police cuts and...
Yeah, but he isn't making it, John. He should be shouting that from the rooftops. He should be speaking about nothing else. But he doesn't. He speaks about everything else.
Internet hate crime is vile. We know that. 1,200 police officers seconded to deal with this, George, in the current political and social climate. I think they would be better represented out on the street.
You bet. You bet. I mean, we have a mayor with the wrong priorities who seems to me to lack political energy. He maybe goes out jogging and all that, at least he used to, but he lacks political energy. The political energy to make the political weather. If he could make the political weather in London, that weather would be screaming out, give us more police. In fact, if I were him, I'd appoint more police and I'd send the bill to the government, legal or illegal. I'd let the government sue me. I would appoint new security forces in London, whether under the Met's rubric or under something else. I would not accept that our people would be victims of what can only be described as an uncontrollable wave, because it's out of control now. Because I talk to coppers and they tell me that don't be reassured by the sight of police cars hurtling hither and thither. In fact, they're chasing their tail. They can't keep up with the level of crime and violence in London.
Well, you said that you know of a place, one of these backstreet surgeries. That's shocking in itself.
Yeah.
And
I was shocked by it, John. I saw it on Ray Donovan happening in the United States. A criminal gets shot. He can't go to the hospital because the hospital will tell the police, and then there'll be inquiries and so on. So he goes in Ray Donovan to a vet, and the vet is a criminal.
Vets. Like this guy said on Julia's show. She said, so you go to a vet, and the kiddie said, I just give him like a big wad of cash, and he sews me up. Now, of course, the kiddie could be BSing her. I don't know. But I don't think he was.
No, well, I've been told by someone who seemed to me to be of the criminal fraternity who told me that there was exactly such a place in my borough. He didn't tell me where it was, of course, because if he did, I'd have told the police. But in my borough of Brent, there is a place where criminals are getting sewn up.
Oh, man alive. Well, and I just
That's how I know the number. That's why I said one every 60 minutes. Because that was your stat, and I know that the number is greater than that, but that number cannot be gainsaid.
And the number of people attending major trauma centres. There was a lad just tonight, 16 years old, lifted by air ambulance, and his condition is life-threatening. And the brazenness of it is what is.
Oh, totally. We're talking broad daylight here. What's the comedian that got his watch nicked in broad daylight? McIntyre.
Michael McIntyre.
Broad daylight. The attacks on cars on the North Circular, broad daylight. The attack on the car in Croydon, broad daylight. Anyway, I've got to go, John. A pleasure as always talking to you, because I need to squeeze in one more call from Mike in Newcastle in Staffs. On you go, Mike.
Hi, George.
Hi.
I certainly hope you get a new show, George, every day.
Yeah, well, there's enough to talk about, isn't there? There's enough to talk about.
I'm just wondering, George, we've still no outcry, no sympathy for this Julius Skripal. I just sound like built to Meldrew, but I just can't believe it. Why is there no sympathy for her, George? What's the answer?
I don't know. There's no. Well, I feel a great deal of sympathy for her. She obviously has suffered a tremendous trauma and has had to have a very serious operation. You could see the wound on her neck. So I don't know that it's true, Mike, that nobody has sympathy for her.
I meant in the press, as regards.
Well, yeah. I mean, they're ignoring.
Freedom,
well, they just don't want. They don't want anybody to talk about it, Mike. It's an embarrassment. It's like somebody in your family did something really embarrassing, and everyone has kind of subliminally agreed just not to talk about it.
They say that no solicitor will be volunteered to do this habeas corpus. Have you heard that?
No, I didn't know that. But you need someone with locus to bring a habeas corpus case to the court. And because they refused the visa application of the family member, then there is nobody currently in Britain who has the locus to bring a habeas corpus writ.
Right.
Mike, thanks. It's been a pleasure. Russell says, prodded by his nanny to say something clever, Gavin Pike, don't tell him your name, Pike, was determined to face down Madeley and give him what for. But Richard told him to go away. Richard definitely did that. George, still no mention in the MSM that nearly a month ago, on Friday, the 9th of the 5th, Trump cancelled all funding with immediate effect to the White Helmet actors. $50 million. He did. John says all mainstream British newspaper, front pages, same day, same story, day after the nerve agent attack. They must have used the same source. Indeed they did. George, what utter rubbish you're saying tonight about Russia. Remember they shot down Flight 17 above the Ukraine, killing all on board. They're capable of anything. They were involved in the chemical attack. America should take out evil Vladimir Putin before they start a world war, says Graham in Fort William. You've got to love him. You've got to love him. Thugs preying on the old and vulnerable, just like the Tories have done for years. Corruption for all to see. Time to wake up. Your mother of all talk shows is important, George. Thank you. Kev in Coventry. It's so important that even though I'm desperate for the toilet, I really, really don't want to leave the podium. If Ian Lee is late, I'll stay on as long as you give me time to run out. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you, and if it was, come back next Friday at 7 p.m. for the mother of all talk shows, and bring somebody else with you, a new listener from every one of you, please.